Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Okay, this week we're going to start what may end up being a 3 or 4 or 5 episode series on perhaps the most difficult objection that people will raise against theism, the belief in God, and against Christianity. And it usually comes in forms that are somewhat hidden, but it always comes back to some version of the problem of evil. How could a good God, who's all-powerful, allow the kind of suffering and pain we see in the world? And sometimes you'll see this nuanced, and depending on who you're talking to. But if you listen carefully, you'll see there is some strand of the problem of evil that is part of their objection, either part of their own experience. They've suffered some evil or have seen others suffer some evil, and it gives them pause. Or it's something that they just are kind of routinely raising because they've heard the objection online, or whatever it may be. And we don't want to minimize it. And so what we're going to try to do is offer a response over the next several weeks. Now, before I begin this, and I'll probably say this every one of these episodes, there's 2 ways to respond to this. There's the kind of intellectual problem of evil, the way we think about the problem and parse it out, and can an argument be made to respond. But there's really a much more difficult issue, I think, which is the emotional, realistic, really the existential problem of evil. It's how we experience it in our real lives. And there are times when it doesn't seem even appropriate to me to respond to the problem of evil with some set of arguments, or some set of descriptions, or some set of rationalizations, or even if I think there's a real robust, true intellectual response to the problem of evil. But there are times when it just doesn't even seem like it's the right thing to do, is to offer it, because you've got people who are hurting and just need to be held in some way, someone to walk through the process with them, to somebody to show them the love of Christ rather than the reasoning of Christ or the reasoning of God in this situation. So I'm going to have to separate these two, and of course, this next set of episodes we're going to do is really going to deal with the first kind of response, the more intellectual, rational response. And let's face it, there are times when you're working as a cold case detective with a family who has been waiting for justice based on some act of evil that occurred 30 years ago that was never resolved, that needs to be resolved. And really, not always cops aren't always the best people to do both of these things. I can kind of work through the reasons why this crime may have occurred and even put that puzzle back together in a way that allows me to go after the bad guy. But that doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to be in tune as much as I should be with the distraught emotional experience that the family is having lost their loved one to a murder. So there are 2 legs of this problem, and I think cops are sometimes, at least detectives are sometimes better at the more rational puzzle piecing kind of aspect of it than we are at the kind of counseling, kind of patiently walking through a process. We're like, about business. Let's figure out how this happened, why this happened, and get the guy who did it. And that's kind of our reasoning on these kinds of things. So I will offer for you a response that probably is more akin to the detective response than it would be to a counselor response. But I think it's important for us to be able to offer. I will say this: if we enter into a season of suffering, or a season of doubt based on the problem of evil, we are far more likely to weather even the emotional roller coaster that might bring us to if before we get there, we have thought through rationally why God would allow this to happen. Because there might be a day when you don't feel it and you don't get it emotionally, but you've got to hold on to it intellectually to overcome the emotional roller coaster you're about to go on. So I hope that as we talk about the problem of evil over the next couple of episodes, that this will help you to kind of be prepared in advance. Now, what we're going to do is cover an approach that I talk about in my book, God's Crime Scene, which kind of looks at a cumulative case approach to many things. including the problem of evil. So I will break this down over the next couple of weeks in pieces. We're going to begin with really the role that two factors play that I think are probably the most critical of the 5 or 6 or 7 I'm going to offer. These are the roles of eternity, what role eternity plays, how we think about eternity, and what role free agency plays. And as I said, this is part of a larger approach that I take in a book called God's Crime Scene. Now, there are times when you're looking at a crime scene, and I use the analogy in this book in order to help you think about the evidence for God. So what I try to do is say, imagine you're in a crime scene, and crime scenes end up being really about trying to determine what happened in the room where the death occurred. And is that, we've got several pieces of evidence in the room surrounding the body. And if we've got these pieces of evidence in the room surrounding the body, we have to explain them some way. And we have to make a choice. Can we explain the things we see in the room by staying in the room? Or do we have to go outside the room for an explanation? If we can stay inside the room, so for example, if I've got a dead person in a room, but next to the body I've got a note written in the handwriting of the person who's deceased using his stationery and his pen, well, that stuff's been in the room from the very beginning. So I can explain all of that by staying inside the room for an explanation. If also, for example, I find that he's been killed with a pistol that is registered to him. It's his pistol. It's been in his room in his house for years. He's owned it for years. Well, I can also explain this piece of evidence by staying inside the room. If for example, he's only got one gunshot wound, well, I mean, he could actually do this on his own, and I can explain this by staying inside the room. So now, of the 4 kinds of death that you have to pick from, natural, suicidal, accidental, or murder, it's not going to be a murder if you can explain all of it by staying inside the room. Of course, it wouldn't probably be a natural, but it would be an accidental or a suicide if all the important pieces of evidence I see in the room can be explained by staying inside the room. It's going to fall into one of these categories. On the other hand, if I have to go outside the room for an explanation, because that's the best way to explain the evidence. So for example, what if that letter is not in his handwriting? What if that letter is in somebody else's handwriting? It's not his stationery. It's not his pen. His fingerprints aren't on it. As a matter of fact, there's an unknown set of fingerprints on that note. Well, now I have to go outside the room to look for the person who wrote it because it doesn't belong to anybody in the room. Not only that, if the pistol at his side is not registered to him, it's registered to somebody else, an unknown person, unknown fingerprints, unknown DNA on that pistol, I've got to go outside the room to explain that. If there's a multiple gunshot wounds, let's say he's been shot in the back 5 times, well, I can't really explain that well by just using him as the only causal factor inside the room. I need to go outside the room looking for who could actually execute that kind of a thing. And finally, let's say I had footprints that were leading outside of the room in blood, the blood of the victim. Well, clearly the best explanation for those footprints is outside the room. Okay, given all that, now I've got to look outside the room for the best explanation for this evidence. And why? That's because I've got evidence of an intruder. And intruders, as I always say, and I say in the book, they change everything. They change what could be just a benign death scene into a more serious potentially a homicide scene. In fact, when you have evidence of an intruder, your death scene does become a crime scene. And in fact, if you might have some sense of curiosity about why somebody would have died accidentally or how they died naturally or why they would have killed themselves, once you have evidence of an intruder, now you have to have that sense of curiosity shift into a sense of urgency because you've got a short period of time in which to go find the person who did the murder. I offer this analogy because we could take the same approach, it seems to me, with the entire universe. We could ask the question, is the best explanation for the pieces of evidence in the universe found inside the room of the natural universe, or do we have to go outside the room of the natural universe? Remember, if we can explain it from inside, then some set of internal natural causes, natural forces of space, time, and matter, laws of physics and chemistry can get it done. If those things can't get it done, I've got to go outside the natural realm of the universe for a better explanation. And we look in the book at 8 pieces of evidence in the room, from cosmological evidence and biological evidence to mental evidence, and finally the last category is moral evidence, and we end up right here in this last segment in the book of what is really moral evidence in the universe. And the last piece of moral evidence is the existence of of evil and injustice. And everyone's got to explain that. And what kind of evidence is this? And is this evidence that inclines us to point to the same suspect as the other pieces of evidence? Or is this a piece of evidence that excludes that suspect? That's what we look at. And we take a simple approach. We make a list in the book of the 8 pieces of evidence that we have to explain. And then we also offer the 2 explanations you can give for these things. Either you're going to stay inside the room and offer a natural explanation, or you're going to go outside the room and offer a supernatural explanation. So in the book, the very last chapter is chapter 8 on the presence of evil and injustice. So what we're going to do this week, and probably the next couple of weeks, is take a look at this piece of evidence from God's crime scene and talk about whether or not it is best explained by staying inside the room or going outside the room, and what it means, and how would we explain it. And along the way, we will offer a rational explanation for the problem of evil we all experience, and everyone experiences it, whether you're a theist or an atheist. Your worldview somehow has to account for why it is so. So we'll talk about that after the break.
In addition to Jim's daily blog and weekly podcasts and videos, Jim continues to write books designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker. These resources will help you defend what you believe and share it with others.
Okay, let's begin kind of talking about and stepping through the nature of evidence and the nature of this 8th piece of evidence that I talk about in God's crime scene, the existence and presence of evil and injustice in our universe. Now, I often will, in the book, refer back to cases that either I have worked, or in this case, a case that my father worked many, many years ago, in which he arrested somebody for a crime that happened to a little girl, 30, 40 years ago, that was never solved. My dad is this gentleman right here on the far side of the screen. And this really opened up for me a way of looking at the kinds of cases that we work related to the problem of evil. Let me explain why. This particular girl was kidnapped on a holiday and was murdered on that holiday. And you might ask yourself, a little girl, anytime a crime happens to a child, you have to really your heart's broken. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why would that happen? Well, it turns out this particular crime was made possible by a set of unique circumstances that have to be explained. And I can best explain them by charting them in this diagram for you. So here is the diagram I've used to chart them in the book. This little girl was a particular kind of little girl that would allow herself, she was open enough to strangers, that she would allow strangers to talk to her. In fact, she was likely to even get in the car of a stranger. If not for that condition, this crime would never have occurred. But not only that, it happened to occur on a holiday in which her parents were busy preparing for the holiday, so they were really paying less attention to where their daughter was than they would have on a regular day. Had that not been the case, this crime would never have occurred. So we have 2 things that have to be in place just perfectly. The third thing is that probably the person who did this crime has got some kind of troubled upbringing themselves. Most of these kinds of cases I work against children usually involve a suspect that if he had not had that kind of troubling experience himself as a young person, this would never have happened. So now I've got 3 conditions that have to be just so in order for this crime to occur. A fourth thing is that this particular girl was in a remote neighborhood in our city, and this particular suspect must have had some familiarity with this neighborhood. It's not the kind of thing you just drive off major roads and find. It was kind of tucked away in a corner. So I need 4 things to come together just perfectly in order for this crime. Here's a 5th thing I need to come together just perfectly. He had to have the perfect vehicle in which to execute the crime. And here's a 6th thing. He had to have really opportunistic timing. And he happened to take a girl, voluntarily she probably got in his car, at a time when nobody else happened to be in the neighborhood to see it. So just the right set of circumstances had to occur in the right way in order for this crime to occur at all. And I've found this to be the case over and over and over again. Not only do these circumstances have to be just so, but there are kind of interconnecting relationships between the different factors. And these all play so it's very complicated. It's not just that these 5 or 6 or 7 things exist, that they exist in a certain relationship to one another. And then this is then how I have to kind of unpuzzle it or repuzzle it in order to figure out what were the causal factors that accounted and allowed for this singular evil act to occur. Okay, folks, this is how we work all crimes. Anytime we're trying to reconnect the dots and figure out why something evil occurred in an investigation, what we're doing is we are looking for the potential explanations for why it might occur and what the relationships would be between these potential explanations to explain any single act of evil. Now that's important for us to kind of think about as we move forward here, because I believe that there are, we looked at kind of the evidence I showed you earlier, the 8 pieces of evidence that are in the universe that I think are best explained by actually going outside the universe. But I offer in the book how I think that these other 7 pieces of evidence, between cosmological evidence and biological evidence and mental evidence and the existence of objective transcendent moral truths, all really, I think, point best toward a particular suspect. And that suspect, I think, is the divine suspect outside the room we talk about when we talk about God. But we have this additional piece of evidence, evil and injustice. How do we explain this? It turns out that all of these evidences that point to a suspect are called inculpating evidences. Inculpating evidences. But if you've got a piece of evidence that seems to point away from your suspect, maybe to somebody else or some other cause, that is called a piece of exculpating evidence. Is evil and injustice a piece of exculpating evidence? How in the world could we resolve the existence of a good God with the presence of evil? As a matter of fact, Epicurus is usually credited with this classic kind of formation of the problem. Let's read it together. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Well, then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? In other words, if there's an all-powerful, all-loving God, why is there evil? Can he not stop it? Well, then he's not all-powerful. Does he not care to stop it? Then he's not all-loving. If you're going to posit the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God, he ought to be able to eliminate these kinds of things from happening. And that is the problem. Now, think back to the explanation I offered for you of that crime that my dad worked years and years ago, still an open case. And I want you to see how a similar approach has to be taken with any act of evil. If you think God exists, why would he allow something like this to happen? Well, it turns out that I think there are 7 things that might explain why God would allow a single act of evil, even a history of evil on our planet. I think the first thing is, what we're going to talk about today, an accurate view of eternity helps us to understand why God would allow this, but also just a proper understanding, a proper reverence for free agency. The appropriate definition of love would help us. Also, the role that evil plays in character development and God's desire to call us, and how it sometimes exists as a consequence. We'll talk about that later on. And finally, our limited understanding of what God is trying to accomplish. These, I think, are the 7 factors that have to be thought about, have to be considered cumulatively to understand why God would allow any single or collective act of evil. Now think about it. In the past, if somebody offered one of these, you might say, oh, come on. I'm not suggesting that any one of these is the explanation for why God would allow evil. It's all of these are the explanation for why God would allow evil. They must be considered collectively the same way I considered all the factors that accounted for the act of evil in my own city with the little girl. Why? Because it's always done this way. It's always cumulative. The question can be offered briefly. The response never can. Keep that in mind. So I want to start, before the next break, quickly to talk about the role that I think, the accurate role that eternity must play. Once you have an accurate view of how we assess eternity, I think it's very helpful. So let's just start with that right now. When I was an atheist, I believed that life really was defined by the 90 years between death in birth. These 90 years is what I expected to get pain-free. If you get 90 years pain-free, what are you really complaining about? On the other hand, if you come down with some terminal illness at the age of 40, and then you suffered for 10 years and died at the age of 50, I would have said that this truly is evil. And why would I say that? Because there's a period of evil suffering. My expectation, remember, was to try to get 90 years pain-free. If I didn't get 90 years pain-free, then I felt like the time I would have lost was the truest indication of evil. And this is why I looked at the world this way. Now, you can see why. If your expectation is a pain-free, joyous life, any bump in that road is going to be seen as evil. But what if my old naturalistic view of what life really is wrong? What if I'm wrong about just the base nature of my understanding of what life is wrong? What if I'm wrong about just the duration of life? For example, what if life is not a line segment, but is instead a line ray that begins at birth, travels to that point we call death on earth, and then we go off into the distance eternally, infinitely in this direction? Would that change things? I think it would. Many of you, when you were young, suffered some form of apparent evil because, for example, you went through an operation, you suffered, you were treated medically, you suffered some period of time. I know lots of people who maybe in the first year they were born went through major surgery, spent the first year in the hospital. Now, by the time these people were 10 or 12 years old, they had largely forgotten. And I ask them all the time, by the time you were 5, did you remember that you were in the hospital for a year? Well, no. Why? Because some time has now gone by since that period of evil was suffered. It turns out that every act of evil typically is measured within the lifespan of the person who experiences it. And when that's the case, you have a tendency to put the time of suffering in its proper relationship because it's really experienced at one point in your life, but you moved on since then. So you see in the context, looking back in your rearview mirror, exactly what role that suffering played. You also see what level of true impact it had on your life, all of these things. And so if this is life, then you can see why suffering, has to be measured within the short context of 90 years. Now, if the Christian worldview is true, your life really isn't 90 years. If the Christian worldview is true, what you experience from cradle to grave is but a fraction, a millisecond compared to your real life. So any evil that might occur, even if you had 90 years of pure horror evil, but you were a Christian who had trusted Christ for your salvation and are being guaranteed life in heaven eternally with God, this is really the nature of your life. So that act of evil has to be measured. And by the way, it's measured going off through that wall all the way out forever. It never stops. Now that's something to think about because now you're measuring evil in a different way. You're measuring evil in the context of what life really is from a theistic Christian worldview. It's measured in terms of eternity. And that changes everything. The same way that any evil you might have suffered as a child has to be measured in the context of your life today, any evil you would suffer in this temporal life here on earth has to be measured and considered in terms of eternity. This changes the paradigm dramatically. And that's why I listed it first. I think before we even begin to explain why God would allow any particular act of evil in your life, you have to first have an idea of what your life really is. And if you still think it's only that period of life between cradle and grave, you have a wrong view of the thing it is you're measuring against to decide what's evil to begin with. That is the problem.
Be sure to visit the Cold Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold Case Christianity podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily case note email.
When you look at the cumulative case for why God might allow any particular act of evil, we'll take one more step after considering eternity and consider this, a proper understanding of what free agency is. Here's what I mean by that. I typically ask people, if you're doubting the existence of an all-loving God based on the fact that we have evil in the world, well then ask yourself this question. Which would be the thing you would expect an all-loving God to create? A world in which love is possible, or a world in which love is impossible? I mean, if you think there's a loving God, isn't it more reasonable to assume that he would be creating a world, or want to create a world at least, in which love is possible? Certainly the alternative is not good if he's a loving God. Well, here's the problem with that. Here's a card I like to read to people. I think this is a great Valentine's Day card, right? It says, "You will love me. Roses are red, bullets are lead. Take me back now or get shot in the head." Now that's a ridiculous card. Why? Because we know that you cannot coerce love. You cannot force someone to love you. That's why we laugh at that card. And this is the problem. This is really the explanation for the problem, is that a world in which love is possible requires this dangerous thing called free agency, the ability to choose love freely. And the problem with free agency is that free agency requires the freedom to do just the opposite of loving somebody. It requires the freedom to hate. And without that freedom to choose wrong instead of right, you don't really have the freedom to choose right. You're just a robot who's programmed to love. That's not true love. If you're just programmed to always respond yes, 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 you're not making decisions. You're just programmed to respond that way. And that's what we're saying here. True love, in order to be genuine, has to be the product of free agency, which means I've got to create a world that is dangerous, inherently dangerous, because I've got to give you the free agency to choose love in order for love to exist. Now you want me as a loving God to create a world in which love is possible? Are you sure you want that? Because if I give you that, there'll be some people who won't choose love. Now, I think it would be evil for God to give you that kind of freedom and then not tell you how to use that freedom without abusing it. It's not like God throws a knife at you and does not tell you which way to catch it. He doesn't do that. He actually gives us this kind of free agency and then gives us guidance and boundaries so we know how not to abuse it. Now, there are people who will ignore the guidance and the boundaries. But when they do that, that's not on God. That's on the people who are taking advantage of the one thing God has given them without looking at the rules he has set in place so you won't abuse these freedoms. God's done both according to the Christian worldview. He's giving you the free agency necessary so love is possible, and giving you guidance on how not to abuse that. If you do abuse it, it's not because of God. God actually gave you the best gift, a universe in which free agency is available to you. These two things we've talked about, eternity and free agency, I think have great depth in explaining why God would allow evil in this universe. And we talk about this a lot on our website, coldcasechristianity.com. And if you visit, you'll see we've got podcasts on us, an entire section just on the problem of evil. I hope you will take a look at it. I think it'll be helpful to you. And, of course, we talk about this in much more depth in the book, God's Crime Scene. All right, having said that, I hope this helps you this week. We'll continue it next week right here at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.